That's a strong opener right there. Jennifer.
Jazza.
Have you ever used alcohol markers?
A little bit.
So you have a bit of an idea as to how they work?
Yeah.
Cool. So for the uninitiated amongst our audience, I have this thing, which is a Copic airbrush. It's literally compatible with Copic markers, which you can unlid, plug in, hook up to an airbrush or a standalone air canister and apply it like an airbrush. Imagine this is your miniature. That is what acrylic paint does. You have an opaque covering that just covers. This is alcohol ink. And the great thing is, it means that if you've already done something with acrylic paints, your layering will serve to include both. But it also means if you're using it thinly over an already painted material or a clean flat base, you can get a really even coverage that still has as much translucency as you want. If you color anything with alcohol inks and add a new layer, you keep some of the properties of the original with the color that you've added. So that's a huge feature. It's super awesome because it creates blending, which results in the ability to create really smooth transitions in colors. But it also means it's quite hard to add color or change color unless you're sort of pre-prepared. Alcohol inks get reactivated with alcohol inks. So even though I made this 6 months ago, if I put isopropyl alcohol on it, you'll notice it immediately reacts.
Oh yeah, oh wow.
You ready?
I'm terrified. At first I was like, oh, this will be super easy, and now you've explained all this color theory.
I recommend not only that you dabble before you dive with the Copic airbrush, but that you dabble before you dabble before you dive with markers.
All right, let's get started.
Go.
Ooh, that's nice. I like that. So blue and yellow make green, so I'm gonna try with a blue marker and see how they layer up. It definitely makes the green. You can see it in the middle there. They're probably not as smooth as an airbrush, but I think it'll be really interesting to try on a model. I'm gonna try a grey because I really wanna see how this actually shows up on paper. Yeah, it definitely mutes down the colors a bit too, so it's a good way to sort of bring it back if it's too vibrant, which is really interesting. So I'm gonna have a play on a couple of models and see how some of the colors turn out. So with my models all primed, it was time to start spraying down some of the alcohol inks. So with my first model, I just wanted to see if I could create a simple gradient and to see how the colors laid down. This included both light and dark. One of the first things I noticed with the Copic marker that's probably a downside is the fact that if you get too close to it, it actually creates this really glossy effect. This was just something I needed to be aware of, to make sure I wasn't going too close to the model and that it would take more layers than it would on a normal airbrush to create the color I wanted. The other thing I also noticed is that like Copic markers, once you put down a color, you can't necessarily go back up to light. So for example, my model was green and I wanted to add some yellow, but unfortunately, because that green is a darker color, I can't put any of the yellow on top of it. This is something to consider later on where I'd have to start from the lightest colors working my way down. For this model in particular, this guy with the sword, I decided to try the Murray method with this one. I picked out a red, purple, and blue Copic markers to use. The aim for this model was to try and create the shadows that we usually do with airbrush cans and see if it worked this way. I was pretty happy with this result. I found that the inks give a bit more depth and contrast to the models, and overall it just looks really good. So for the next two models, I had primed these in at two specific colors. The Jasmarine was done in red, while the Valkyrie was done in yellow. For the Jasmarine, I just wanted to create a bit more depth and see how easy you could do this method if you were, say, batch painting an entire Space Marine army. Moving on to the Valkyrie, this time I wanted to try a different color altogether. Because I knew she had been sprayed in yellow, I wanted to see how purple would lay down. And after spraying it, it pretty much worked as how Jazz has said. If you lay a transparent color on top of another, it's gonna mix together and turn into a different color entirely. In this case, it turned orange, which is really surprising but gave this gorgeous effect. In some of the darker areas, it did turn slightly purple browny sort of color, which I didn't really particularly want, but it was a very interesting test to see how these colors blended together. If I had an army of these, I'd be pretty impressed. They're pretty badass. Now this was a model that Jazza had painted before on a previous video. I was absolutely petrified that I would muck this model up, but he assured me he didn't really mind what I did to it. With this model, I knew I really wanted to try and achieve that contrast that Jazza couldn't get on his first round. This meant that I needed to try and build up some of that yellow and orange at the front where there'd be like a campfire or a bright source of light, contrasting to his back where I wanted some purples and dark blues to make sure that that shadow was really there. One of the downsides I did find with using this airbrush was the fact that the actual spray and trajectory of the airbrush can't be controlled. This unfortunately meant that when I wanted to create the really defined shadows, it kind of overblew. Again, Jazza had reminded me that I can use isopropyl alcohol to bring some of it back, so I did. Overall, I think this was a pretty good dabble, and I think I'm ready for my dive. Okay, now I'm not gonna lie, I've been wanting to paint this bust for a really long time. I already have an idea for how I want this to look. In particular, I wanted to create a gradient that went from yellow, purple to blue, knowing that the colors in between would be able to blend well together. The idea being that the warmest color would be at the top and the coldest at the bottom. I would say overall, this bust probably took me about an hour to paint. Now, that's only because the airbrush works in very thin, low opacity layers. So it's gonna take a while to actually build up that color, and working from something that was white, it was gonna take a long time.
This video is brought to you by our participation in My Mini Factory's summer sale, meaning you can now support the channel and get 30% off of everything in our My Mini Factory store, including the Space Bears vehicle bits that we just launched, as well as all of our other Space Bears bits, the incredible Space Bears busts, our cyber werewolves, and our apocalypse ghost. We even have a few surprises coming later this month, but for now, don't delay. Go to the link in the description and use the code TTT30 off to get 30% off of everything on our My Mini Factory store for your 3D printing and hobbying. It's a huge support to Tabletop Time and our content and our game dev goals. Once again, link in the description. TTT30 off, get 30% off and get yourself something nice. How's it go?
Really, really good, really good. It was a bit of a trial and error. There were some good and some bad things that I kind of found with the airbrush, but let me show you and I'll explain a couple of things. With this one in particular, the little guy with the sword, I tried the Murray method as well.
Ah, cool.
So, and it kind of worked. Like you can see some blue and some purple and a bit of red as well. So it came out all right.
It's interesting how like I sort of alluded to at the beginning, if you did it with acrylic paints, they would maintain their same value.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't get darker, but because you've used the Murray method, but they're translucent, you can sort of see where there's been more layers because it gets darker.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So from there, we went on to spraying with a color first.
This is really eye-catching.
Yeah.
Like, that is a really punchy red.
It is. So this was sprayed with the Vallejo red and this was sprayed with the Vallejo yellow. And then we used the Copic inks on top of them.
Now this is interesting.
Yeah, so...
You went more subtle with this.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to try and create more contrast, but I was a little scared because it's a model that you had painted.
This is like my worst ever paint job. It was an airbrush only challenge, but the funny thing is, this one, when I did that collab with Miniac a while back, I wanted to try and create a highlight like it's from light, but because I did it with paint, it really washed it out and killed any color that I'd put down.
Yeah.
But the way it works when you're doing it with, in this case, alcohol inks, it actually keeps the vibrancy.
Yeah.
It makes it pop.
100%.
And what is happening here?
So I'm a big color person. I love things vibrant and colorful. So this was something that I really wanted to make super vibrant.
Using ink this way, you're going to keep all the detail. You're not going to have any of the issues with building up acrylic inks and losing your detail. So when you're painting minis, actually doing base colors with alcohol inks could be a really great way to keep the crisp look.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Whew, I love it. All right, dive time.
I really want to experiment with some transparent resin because I think that the colors are really going to pop on it, but I'm not sure. Yeah, what do you think?
Go for it.
Yeah, all right, cool. So David printed out these models for me in translucent resin and I'm ready to paint these up. I had a pretty strong idea of how I wanted these to look, and again, as you can imagine, it was going to be super colorful. I started off with the horses first, knowing I wanted to create more of a ghosty feel to them, but I definitely wanted to make them look more ethereal perhaps, or like spirits, instead of them being ghosty and creepy and scary. I knew to start spraying down the lightest colors first and working my way down. In this case, I was was working from a gradient that would go from yellow, green to blue. I knew in this instance the green would possibly be the darkest color, while the blue would maybe even be the lightest. Once I was happy with how the horses turned out, it was time to do the little thing that goes on. I don't know what this is called. It just connects all the horses together, a bridle maybe, but I decided to paint this orange and yellow to try and transition into the other colors which the carriage would be. Then it was time for the carriage itself. Now I definitely wanted to paint this in a different color to how the horses looked. Maybe giving this feeling that something that was living was a different set of colors to something that was man-made or was an object. So in this case, I wanted to make it the most tutti frutti color I possibly could, working from a gradient this time that went from orange to red to purple. This gradient of colors is probably my favorite. I don't know why, it just looks so cool. It's very reminiscent of something I'd get from like a Polly Pocket or a Barbie doll when I was a kid. And I kind of wanted to spray it in glitter, to be quite honest, but I held my temptation and I knew that altogether this was gonna look absolutely sick and probably the most craziest thing I have ever painted. With my tutti frutti ghosts all done, it was time to move on to my last project. Now Jazza specifically wanted me to try painting his spectral ghost in his apocalypse scene. With all of the lessons I had learnt before, I knew to start with my lightest colors first. I was going to be working in a gradient this time that went from yellow, green to blue, which I had done before, but this time I was going to try and create a lot more contrast. In particular, her face and her heart I wanted to try and keep yellow, and the bottom of her feet as well. While the back of the model I wanted to keep that contrast and definitely make it darker than the rest. In the end, I'm pretty happy with how this model turned out. I think that the Copic airbrush can be a bit fiddly and you can overwork it a little bit, so you do need to take it in steps and you need to take your time with it. But nevertheless, I'm still really happy with how this turned out and the results speak for themselves. It's really vibrant.
Why are you laughing? I like it.
It's ridiculous.
It's great. I want to see a whole tabletop army with this. This is so good.
So I mentioned before that I love color. I love playing with color. It's one of my favorite things. And I think that gradients just worked really well with this translucent resin. I couldn't go past not trying to make these as super colorful as possible.
You've done some cool stuff here, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Speaking of thanks, look who it is. Our bloody patrons.
Thank you.
Like the support of the My Mini Factory page, the Patreon enables us to do what we can do, and we're so thankful to our patrons. So thank you for your support, each and every one of you. We really appreciate your contribution to allow us to make awesome stuff like this.
I actually really like this model.
Yeah. Do you know what would work really well too? You do like the translucent like ink effects and then actually just paint the clothes and stuff on top. So they will look like super ghosty. Oh, I want to do that now.
Yeah, it's
Let us know in the comments if you want to see like an army scheme of ghosty things painted like that, because that can look really cool.
I'm not gonna lie, I kind of thought, you know, in The Simpsons, the Venus de Milo?
Yes! Oh my God. I sort of want to snap her arms off now. That's perfect.
Same with this too. Dave showed it to me and he's like, you know, this is a fruit tingle, right? So, I mean, don't eat these.
Amazing.
I wouldn't recommend eating either of these products.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
In conclusion, for our many days dive into this medium, don't eat it.
Yeah.
Wait, it's alcoholic.